Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. We have a great show for you today because in a matter of days, and we have to cover all of this, U.S. President Donald Trump has done an about-face, promising more weapons to Ukraine, threatening BRICS with more tariffs following the organization's massively successful summit, yet remaining silent on Yemen's successful operations in the Red Sea that have sunk not one, but two Israeli-linked vessels in just a matter of days. Trump is doubling down on the U.S.'s many fronts of war and is exposing a brutal fact. The empire is not just naked, it is desperate and declining too. To discuss all these developments, I have good friend of the show. He is host of Geopolitical Economy Report, Ben Norton. Ben, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure.
Of course, everyone hit the like button as you come on, and that will help boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. All right, Ben. Well, let's get started. How about with this? Let's talk about West Asia. I haven't had you on since all of the very significant developments from what is called the 12-day war to now. What I want to first show is in the Red Sea, you have Yemen conducting massively successful operations. They've said they have conducted, Ansarallah has conducted 45 in just a matter of days, sinking two ships. I'm just going to play in the background just one of these, Eternity Sea, which is a Greek-owned vessel, which was doing business going to the Eilat port, which Yemen has blockaded. So, Ben, I wanted your take, and your analysis on what's been going on. Francesca Albanese, sanctions on her, the UN rapporteur, on Gaza and on what is happening in this region. You also have what's happening with Ansarallah, and of course the 12-day war and the aftermath, which has seen Israel actually not only amplifying its strikes on Gaza and Lebanon, but taking pretty significant hits as well from the resistance. So your analysis on what's been happening, Ben.
Yeah, well, there's a variety of things. I mean, it's so crazy. Every single day there's some kind of new development, and basically it's an intensification of what is a genocide. So, for instance, we've seen that this report was released by Francesca Albanese, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, and she detailed how U.S. companies have been profiting from the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory and the genocide in Gaza. And in response to that, the U.S. government put sanctions on this UN human rights expert, which is, just such a blatant violation of every international law, every international norm. And at the same time as this is happening, there are reports now that Israel has this plan to create concentration camps. And you would think that they would kind of distance themselves from the term concentration. But if you read the reports in the Israeli media, they use the term concentration. That's the term they use to refer to their strategy of concentrating Palestinians in Gaza into these small little enclaves, also known, again, as concentration camps. And then according to these reports in the Israeli media, Israel will kill all Palestinians who are not in the concentration camps. This is just a textbook genocide, everything about it. And the response of the U.S. government is to sanction the people opposing this genocide, to wage war on the people opposing this genocide, and then to give more weapons and support to the people carrying out the genocide. So, of course, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just took a trip to Washington. He met with Donald Trump at the White House while this is all happening. And Netanyahu, in order to fly to the U.S., he went over the airspace of several European countries, which are parties to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And there's an ongoing arrest warrant, an outstanding arrest warrant for Netanyahu over crimes against humanity that he has committed in Gaza. So we see that the West has shown its true face. They don't care about international law. They don't care about human rights. They're carrying out a genocide. All these European countries are also supporting this. And meanwhile, the response of the U.S. is to sanction UN human rights experts and to wage war on Yemen, which is one of the only countries on earth that is actually taking action to try to stop this genocide. Of course, Iran was the other major country supporting the Palestinians and opposing this genocide. And we saw that in June, the U.S. and Israel waged a war on Iran. And it's not over. I mean, now it's called the 12-day war. I don't think it's over. If you talk to anyone in Iran, they all say they're expecting the war to continue. Let's not forget that in January, Trump negotiated a so-called ceasefire, in scare quotes, in Gaza. And in reality, it was not a ceasefire. It was a 2-month pause in which the U.S. rearmed and resupplied Israel so it could continue the genocide, which it did in March. So it was a 2-month pause. And when Israel continued the genocide in March, Trump gave it a green light to do so. So I think it's very likely that the war on Iran will continue at some point. Maybe it's not going to be in a week or a month. It could be in a year, but this is not the end. This is maybe the end of the beginning, but it's certainly not the end. And again, the response of the US government is to wage war on every country that's trying to stop this genocide. So Iran and also Yemen. So when you read the Western media reports about these attacks carried out by Yemen against Israel-linked vessels, they say that it's because this group Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis in Yemen, are crazy. They never explain the justification, the explicitly stated reason for these attacks. The Yemeni government, the de facto government in the majority of Yemen, in the north of Yemen, led by Ansar Allah, has made it clear that they will stop these attacks when the genocide in Gaza stops. This is humanitarian intervention. This is the responsibility to protect, which the US government has invoked many times to justify intervention in Libya and Syria and many countries. Well, now Yemen is doing humanitarian intervention, try to stop a genocide. And every time they intervene, the US bombs Yemen, threatens Yemen. So once again, we see, I mean, we're talking about a completely lawless regime in the US and the West more generally. And everything they do is in blatant violation of international law. And yet they talk about democracy and human rights. It's a complete farce.
Yeah, Ben, what do you make of the fact that there is this active, absolute massacre, genocide happening in Gaza, and yet you have people in that region not giving up? You have Yemen, I said, sinking not one, the Magic Seas vessel, then the Eternity Sea vessel. Both of them were sunk. With Eternity Sea, there were actual casualties from Yemen's multi-purpose attack, missiles and drones, and just an incredible showing to literally blockade the Red Sea still. And then, of course, you have even in Gaza, you have some of the biggest hits that the Israeli military has faced. And all of these have happened right after the so-called cessation of hostilities that occurred in the what's called the Israel-Iran War, the 12-day war, as many have been putting it. So what do you make of this? Because it seems that while the war and the genocide is endless, there also is not a kind of bowing. And I think Iran showed this. I think Yemen is showing this. I think even in Palestine, where the situation is the worst, that is being shown too.
Yeah, well, the capacity of the Yemeni military is pretty limited. Now, when you read the Western media, they talk about the so-called Houthis, which are officially known as Ansar Allah, as the small non-state armed group. But there was a revolution in Yemen in September of 2014. It's called the 21st of September Revolution, led by this group Ansar Allah, that overthrew a dictatorship propped up by the US, a Western puppet dictatorship, and they had a revolution. And many other political forces joined Ansar Allah. It's not just the so-called Houthis that govern the northern part of Yemen. They created a kind of coalition government with other different political forces, and parts of the Yemeni military joined them. So they have a military. It's not just a small non-state group. However, that said, the Yemeni military is not very advanced. It doesn't have the most advanced technology. It doesn't have hypersonic missiles. Iran does have a pretty advanced military. It's not at the same level as, Russia and China, which are, some of the most advanced militaries in the world. But the Iranian military is certainly more advanced than any other military that has been fighting against Israel. Israel is used to bullying on small unarmed or non-state armed groups and unarmed civilians in Palestine and Gaza. Israel is used to massacring children and women in Gaza, and maybe fighting against the El Qassam brigades, which is a small non-state armed group, and they're a guerrilla group. Or maybe, Hezbollah, which is a very advanced guerrilla group, but they're not the Lebanese state to the extent that there even is a Lebanese state. The Lebanese army is also pretty weak. Iran, of all of these different forces, definitely has the most advanced military, and it has hypersonic missiles. And Iran showed that it can hit Israel. It repeatedly hit Israel. It went past Israel's air defense systems, which have multiple layers. We hear about Iron Dome, and now there's this big, scam in the U.S., this marketing scheme by Lockheed Martin and other corporations in the military-industrial complex to sell the idea of the Golden Dome, which is just, like I said, a marketing scam. It's not real. There is no Golden Dome. The U.S. has a Golden Dome. It's called the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. I mean, who is going to... It's absurd. It's so ridiculous. Who's going to wage war on the U.S.? Canada? I mean, Trump's threatening to annex Canada. It's absurd. So there's this marketing scheme of the Golden Dome that Trump is now going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in. That's going to go to military contractors, potentially even Elon Musk's companies. At least it was going to go to SpaceX, but of course Trump and Musk had a falling out. We'll see. Anyway, the point is that we hear a lot about the Iron Dome in Israel. But there are also other layers of air defense systems, including David Sling and all of this. And Iran got past all of it. All of this equipment that we've heard so much propaganda about from U.S. weapons corporations saying they have the best, most advanced technology. Iran was able to get past it. And by the way, for most of the counterattacks carried out by Iran in self-defense against Israel, it was not using its most advanced missiles. So because Iran knew that this war could potentially escalate further, it didn't want to use all of its hypersonics and most advanced missiles and other technologies immediately. It wanted to keep a lot of those in reserves and use some of its older missiles, which is what it did. So I think this is another reason why the war was, at least temporarily, the pause was after only 12 days. And the U.S. has been resupplying Israel for preparations to potentially start the war again. Because what we saw is that Yemen and Iran have shown that these wars, when they're carried on for a long period of time, they can be very expensive for the West, the U.S.-backed forces, the U.S. and Israel, because they're spending every single day tens of millions of dollars on not only all the missiles, but all the interceptors. Because we hear all this propaganda about, David Sling and Iron Dome and all of this. Well, every time they intercept some of these cheap old Iranian missiles, this costs every day millions of dollars just on all these interceptors that they're using, and they don't have an infinite supply of them. So now after 12 days, the U.S. has been resupplying Israel, potentially for preparations for another phase of this war. And Iran, for the first time, has showed that Israel is not unpenetrable. When Israel is fighting against a small guerrilla group in Gaza that has very primitive missiles that they make in their homes, like these are not very advanced missiles. Okay, yeah, maybe Israel's air defense systems can shoot down these very primitive missiles. But when they're dealing with an advanced military like Iran, Iran was able to bloody Israel's nose. It's not just me saying this. There was actually a video of Trump in which he said, man, Israel was really hit hard. Trump himself admitted that. And if Trump said it, that's because he's getting intelligence from the U.S. intelligence agencies saying that, yes, Israel was hit very hard. Now, Israel claims to be a great democracy, which is obviously absurd. It's an apartheid ethno-state. And I mean, even within the 48 borders, to the extent there are borders, Israel is the only country in the world that doesn't actually have borders. But to the extent that it has borders, quote unquote, it's still not a democracy, obviously. Netanyahu famously said that Arab so-called citizens of Israel are not real citizens because they're not Jewish, they're Arab. So, I mean, it's not a democracy. But all that aside, Israel constantly says that, okay, well, we have free press, unlike the so-called authoritarian regimes around Israel. Actually, Israel is one of the most authoritarian regimes of all. But anyway, all that said, in reality, whenever there's a war like this, any kind of armed conflict, Israel has a military censor that controls all of the information that goes out into the public. And especially when Iran was hitting back in self-defense and hitting Israeli military targets in the Mossad headquarters, which, by the way, many of these military targets of the IDF, the IOF, are located in the heart of Tel Aviv, downtown, under civilian targets. So Israel is objectively using its own people as human shields. But anyway, the point is that the Israeli military censor did not allow the public to get access to a lot of information about the Iranian attacks. And of course, the propaganda narrative was that Iran wasn't doing any damage, that Israel was completely safe. That's absurd. We saw videos on social media, at least at first, in which Iran was hitting Israel hard. And then the Israeli so-called democracy announced that any Israeli who publishes social media video of these attacks can be imprisoned. So that's the so-called free press in great so-called democratic Israel. It's obviously absurd. So the point I'm getting at here is that Iran really did bloody Israel's nose. And yeah, they might go back to restart this war, but now they're much more realistic in their expectations. They thought, this is what happens when you believe your own propaganda. The Israeli regime thought that Iran would just collapse overnight, that it was all a paper tiger. They believed their own propaganda. They drank their Kool-Aid, thinking that the people of Iran would rise up and overthrow the Islamic Republic. Supposedly everyone hates it. No, in reality, the Israeli war of aggression and the US war of aggression on Iran has actually increased support in Iran for the Iranian government, because now the people of Iran see that for many years, the Iranian government has said that the US and Israel want to wage war on Iran, to overthrow the Iranian government, to kill Iranian civilians. That's exactly what they did. And yes, critics of the Iranian government said for many years, oh, it's just propaganda, it's not true. Well, now they see it is true. It's undeniable. And as is often the case when a country is attacked, when a people are attacked in a war of aggression, as Iran was, people rally behind the flag and they support the government. So I really think that although, yes, Israel was able to kill some senior Iranian leadership, Iran has always been preparing for this. Iran immediately replaced the military leadership. And I think Iran is actually in a better position now than it was even before the start of this war. And if and when the US and Israel restart the war, I think Iran is going to be much better prepared.
Yeah, and the signs are also being seen in the response to what Yemen is doing, because these two vessels, they're the Western mainstream media, Zionists all over social media, they are calling for the United States, for Donald Trump to get involved. Like, what's going on? Why isn't Donald Trump bombing Yemen? Israel is conducting some limited operations on Yemen, but they want the United States to go back in like it did earlier in the year. And there is absolutely no signal that that is going to happen. And I just wanted to show one thing that has been confirmed, which is significant. Even though the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, it was symbolic, the strike that Iran conducted right before the cessation of hostilities. Well, the Associated Press has confirmed that a $15 million U.S. communications dome at this airbase was destroyed, and they published actually this satellite footage where you can see the massive impact that their strikes made. And even if the United States allowed this, Ben, it's pretty significant that there was this type of precision, and that they are even having to admit this now after so many weeks following the actual strike. But the United States does not really have an appetite, it seems, to go back into Yemen even. And I think that shows that there are some severe limitations that the U.S. has in I'm curious on what you believe those limitations are.
Yeah, again, we saw a lot of propaganda about this, and the Western media said, oh, Iran hit this U.S. military base. It's not significant. It's not significant. No one died. I mean, this was deeply symbolic, very, very symbolic. People say, what is Al Udeid, this base in Qatar? It's the largest U.S. military base in the region in West Asia, and it's the forward operating headquarters of CENTCOM, the U.S. Military Central Command, which oversees all of these wars of aggression the U.S. wages in West Asia against Iraq, Syria, also against Libya as well, and North Africa. So this is very symbolic, and the fact that Iran was destroying this important equipment. Now, yes, it is true that Iran did give a notice so the U.S. could evacuate soldiers to not kill U.S. soldiers, because they didn't want to escalate the war further, because Iran doesn't want to wage war. Iran was acting in self-defense, and Iran has always shown significant patience and restraint. It's the U.S. and Israel that are the aggressors, that are always starting these wars. and their propaganda apparatus and the Western so-called free press, which is not free and it's not even a real media. Its job is not to inform people, it's to manufacture consent for wars of aggression. And they always tell us that supposedly Iran is this evil regime, but in reality, we see that Iran is the one opposing genocide. Iran is the one trying to de-escalate, pushing for diplomacy, and it's the US and Israel that are supporting genocide, colonizing territories, stealing land, ethnically cleansing people, and carrying out wars of aggression. And I should point out that when Iran was attacked in June, it had been engaging in diplomacy with the US. Iran had engaged in several rounds of peace talks with the US, with the Trump administration, because back in Trump's first term, he unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. He tore it up and reimposed sanctions on Iran in violation of international law, a blatant violation of a UN Security Council resolution that the US had supported back under the Obama administration. And that was in the first term. Biden came in, and he was, of course, he claimed that supposedly he would undo Trump's policies. He was a complete hypocrite and a liar. And Biden continued all of Trump's policies, especially in West Asia. He did not broker a new agreement with Iran. And then Trump came in his second term, and he said, yeah, I'm going to broker a new Iran nuclear deal. He carried out 5 rounds of talks, and he was using that as diplomatic cover as the US and Israel were planning to launch these secret attacks on Iran, allegedly to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. And Trump claimed that supposedly he destroyed the 3 most advanced Iran nuclear sites. And of course, this is also likely propaganda. There's been a lot of real investigative journalism pointing out that Trump exaggerated the impact of these US strikes. And Trump said that the US and Israel have put Iran back years in its potential development of nuclear technology. It's actually probably months or maybe even weeks. Now, previously, Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons. This had been reaffirmed many times by international experts, including the IAEA, which we now see has been a tool of the US and Israel. The IAEA was used to spy on Iran, to carry out these surprise attacks on Iran by the US and Israel, which is why Iran has withdrawn from the IAEA. And now it's actually likely that Iran will pursue nuclear weapons because it learned a very clear lesson. It engaged in good faith diplomacy. It signed a nuclear deal with the US under Obama. Trump tore it up. It engaged in good faith peace talks, what it thought were good faith peace talks with the second Trump administration. Trump violated those. He waged war on Iran. He bombed Iranian nuclear sites. So the logical conclusion in Iran is, well, the U.S. cannot be trusted. As President Putin of Russia says, the U.S. is agreement incapable. It is incapable of making agreement and holding that agreement. Why would any reasonable, rational country ever sign an agreement with the U.S. when they know that it could be torn up in a year or two? So Iran is probably going to actually pursue nuclear weapons now. It learned the same lesson that North Korea, the DPRK, learned after, in 2002, the George W. Bush administration announced that it was going to wage war on Iraq, Bush famously gave his axis of evil speech. And what were the 3 countries in the axis of evil? Iraq, Iran, and the DPRK. So the DPRK logically concluded the U.S. is preparing to wage war on Iraq. Iraq does not have nuclear weapons. We should get nuclear weapons because then the U.S. can't wage war on us. The U.S. a year later in 2003 invaded Iraq in a war of aggression, killing 1 million Iraqis, destroying the country. Millions, in addition to the 1 million Iraqis who died, millions more were displaced and turned into refugees. The country has never recovered. So the DPRK got nuclear weapons. The U.S. has never been able to wage war on the DPRK. So the logical conclusion that Iran has come to is it's probably going to actually pursue nuclear weapons after years of propaganda in the West claiming that supposedly it was. Netanyahu has been claiming since the 1990s for 30 years that Iran is mere weeks away from nuclear weapons. Well, here we are 30 years later. That's a lot of weeks, and Iran never got those weapons. But now, after the U.S. and Israel directly bombed Iran and are preparing for more war, it's more likely than ever. And my bet is that yes, Iran will in a few years have nuclear weapons because of this.
And Ben, finally, you're a student of the so-called Cold War, the war over colonies, the wars for national liberation, the wars, against imperialism. And it seems like in West Asia, we are seeing really what is not only a protracted war of aggression led by the U.S. and Israel, now spanning the entire region, from what's the horrors in Gaza all the way to a regime change operation against Iran, but also the resistance back, which appears to not only not be quitting, but it's very unpredictable how much this will explode in the very near future, given that a lot of people were counting Iran out for so long because they hadn't waged Operation True Promise 3. And then yet at the moment when they needed to, they did. I don't think anyone was betting on Yemen continuing a blockade of the Red Sea. And yet we are still here. I don't think anyone was thinking, well, how could anyone be fighting in the rubble in Gaza? It seems unfathomable given the inhumanity that is being imposed on the Palestinians there. And yet they are enacting major blows that is causing major concerns for both Israel and the United States. So your final thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, again, the U.S. and Israel are so used to fighting against helpless women and children or guerrilla low-level armies that are non-state actors. So when they actually fight against Iran or even Yemen, which again is not just it is a state. It's not a strong state, but it has a military, and they have the capacity to actually fight back. Unlike women and children in Gaza, who are the majority of the victims of Israel's genocide. So this is unprecedented. This is historic. Iran has bloodied Israel's nose. Trump himself admitted it. And it's going to be a sign in the future that when the U.S. and Israel try to attack Iran again, which they will do, this wasn't the first time, it won't be the last time. Let's not forget that in Trump's first term, he assassinated Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, probably the most important person in the Iranian government after the supreme leader and the president. I mean, one of the most powerful people. The U.S. killed him, and Trump also assassinated an Iraqi military commander, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, another major act of war against Iraq. And the U.S. is so used to not having any significant response. Iran has shown that it can respond and will continue to respond. So, I mean, this is a very significant development. One other quick note here, Danny, which is, we were talking about West Asia here, and people say, why isn't Trump escalating further? Well, it's also because the U.S. strategy now for well over 15 years has been the so-called pivot to Asia. It's preparing for war, and we're talking about West Asia, but of course, people say the Middle East. Well, where do they think the Middle East is? What continent is it on? It's in Asia. It's West Asia. When they say pivot to Asia, they mean pivot to war on China in East Asia. And this started, of course, under Obama in his first term when Hillary Clinton was his Secretary of State. And the idea was the U.S. would move its military forces out of West Asia and focus on war in East Asia on China. That was continued under Trump in his first term. It was continued under Biden, who deployed offensive missile systems to the northern part of the Philippines. The U.S. now is using several military bases in the Philippines, and the Typhoon missile system that the U.S. has deployed to the Philippines, first under Biden, continued now under Trump in his second term. Those missile systems can hit most major Chinese cities. They have a range of 2,000 kilometers. This is a major escalation, a major provocation against China. And now we see that the defense secretary under Trump, Pete Hegseth, this far-right Christian extremist who calls himself a crusader, he has crusader tattoos of Deus Vult, and he wrote a book called American Crusade in which he proudly said that the U.S. will overthrow the Chinese government. He published that book in 2020, his Crusades book. He gave an extremely hawkish speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, in which he said, quote, We are preparing for war, end quote. So the US is preparing for war on China, potentially over Taiwan. And one of the reasons that the Trump administration is trying to focus less on West Asia is because, like Obama, like Trump in his first term, like Biden, they want to prepare for war on China, but they also want to maintain their hegemonic control over West Asia. And they are using Israel as their attack dog, their unsinkable aircraft carrier, to try to destabilize all of the independent governments. They succeeded in Syria. Syria is now led by the former leader of Al Qaeda, Ahmed al-Shara, who used to be known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani. And this guy was the head, he was the founder and the head of the largest Al Qaeda affiliate ever, which was Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. They rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. And then he rebranded, he puts on a Western suit now. And this guy was a former ally of ISIS. He's the unelected so-called president of Syria. The US has recognized him. Trump just lifted sanctions on Syria. And he's on the verge of normalizing relations with Israel. He's giving speeches saying that we support Israel in its war against Iran because we share a mutual enemy. So, I mean, Iran is really the last standing. Iran and Yemen are the last standing states that have been able to resist U.S.-Israeli colonialism in the region, while the U.S. is preparing for war on China. So, I mean, what's going on, unfortunately, like I keep stressing this is not the end. This is the beginning. Maybe it's the end of the beginning, but this is going to escalate further. There will be more war on Iran, and this is all part of an attempt to prepare for war on China, to isolate China. We already see that the U.S. is at war with Russia through Ukraine, which is a U.S.-led NATO war, using Ukraine as a battering ram, fighting to the last Ukrainian. And if you don't believe me, Trump's former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, who was a top U.S. general who oversaw special operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, Michael Flynn did an interview with Stephen Bannon, who was the CEO of Trump's first campaign. He was his chief strategist in his first term. And in this interview with Steve Bannon, Mike Flynn said that he was asked what the war on Iran was about. He said, China, China, China. He said, if we can overthrow the Iranian government and install a pro-Western regime, a puppet regime in Iran, like the Shah was installed by the U.S. after a CIA-orchestrated coup in Iran in 1953, that overthrew Iran's democratic elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and installed the dictator, the Shah. Well, the U.S. wants to do the same. And as Mike Flynn said, if they can do that, they can isolate China, remove a friendly country, a partner of China, and try to isolate China to prepare for this war that Pete Hegseth says very clearly that they're preparing for.
Yeah, and it's if anyone is just studying what the Trump administration has done in West Asia up until this point, it's quite clear, as you said, that Israel is meant to do all that it can to destabilize the region, and then the United States is supposed to come in and do whatever limited operations it can to finish the job, as people in the U.S., military brass and these sycophantic hawks like to put it. That seems to be the strategy, and it has to be that because the United States is trying to, as Alex Karp, one of the founders of Palantir, as you have noted on this show, Ben, there's a three-front war in Russia, China, and Iran, and West Asia, and there can't be full focus on any one of those unless there is a retreat from one or two of those. So that is a big dilemma, and I think that gets us really into the conversation I wanted to have with you today, Ben, because we just got off of a massively successful, I think a lot of people were underestimating what the BRICS summit in Rio was going to do, BRICS summit 2025 in Rio in Brazil. And I wanted to pull up, we were speaking before this show, Ben, and I wanted to pull up first how Trump has been reacting. So here are the exact words from Donald Trump. It'll be played, I think, in a little bit, a little bit faster, 1.25 speed. I wanted to play this video of his reaction to the BRICS summit because he has been pissed off, as Politico has put it. But here's what he had to say in response to BRICS.
BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too. So anybody that's in BRICS is getting a 10% charge.
Is that immediate, sir? Or
Yeah,
is that
pretty soon.
If they engage in some behavior?
Well, if they're a member of BRICS, they're going to have to pay 10% tariff just for that one thing. And they won't be a member long. I thought BRICS was, I said this about a year ago, and it largely broke up. But, there are a couple that hang around, but I thought it largely broke up. BRICS is not, in my opinion, not a serious threat. But what they're trying to do is destroy the dollar so that another country can take over and be the standard. And we're not going to lose the standard at any time. If you have a smart president, you will never lose the standard. If you have a stupid president like the last one, you would lose the standard. You wouldn't have the dollar as you. And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country anymore.
So, in contradiction to his seemingly downplaying, Ben, you published this political article that I had been also reading on your X account, and I think it's worthy pulling up some of the quotes that the president is pissed per Politico. Trump's Brazil tariff threat. So this comes in the context of threatening 50% tariffs on Brazil and using Jair Bolsonaro's so-called politicized case, as they're putting it, ironically, since Brazil has been a victim of judicial lawfare for many, many years now, is part of a bigger geopolitical dispute. And what is that, Ben? Well, what White House chief strategist is saying is you can tell the president is pissed every time he looks at the BRICS de-dollarization effort. That's Steve Bannon's words. And then, as you quoted, we don't have to look at that one, but this I think is really interesting. This quote by Leland Lazarus, who actually was an advisor to Southern Command under Obama. It's Brazil's increasing alignment with China on UN-denominated trade and other issues may be triggering alarms within Trump's circle, especially among advisors who view global dollar supremacy as a pillar of U.S. power. That's why he also threatened all BRICS members with a 10% tariff, trying to peel off new members like Egypt, Ethiopia, and Indonesia. So, Ben, talk about the significance of this. Donald Trump's seemingly both personal, political, and, of course, the U.S.'s broader war on BRICS is very much in play.
Yeah, it's so funny and it's so schizophrenic because Trump, in that clip and when he speaks about BRICS, he often says, well, BRICS is not a threat, but they're also threatening the dollar, so I need to threaten them with massive tariffs to crush them. In another interview that Trump did in a press conference at the White House, he said that BRICS is dead. He said this right after coming back to the White House for his second term. He said that he threatened tariffs on BRICS, and as soon as he did that, he said BRICS died, which obviously is completely absurd. Not only is BRICS not dead, it's thriving. It's growing in size and influence. It's constantly expanding. This June, Vietnam accepted its invitation to join as a partner of BRICS. And at the summit that was held this July in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, it was a very successful summit. I agree with you. We can talk more about it and some of the Western misleading propaganda about it. But this was the first summit that featured all 10 of the members and the new 10 partner countries that were officially added at the beginning of this year. And last year in 2024, there were 5 new members added, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, the UAE, and Iran. So we were talking about the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran and the fear that the U.S. has of a coalition, a partnership between China, Russia, and Iran. This was spelled out by Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, which basically has become the kind of brain of the U.S. government, especially under the Trump administration. They've been outsourcing so many operations to Palantir. And one of the co-founders of Palantir is the far-right billionaire oligarch Peter Thiel, who employed Vice President J.D. Vance. It was the only real job that J.D. Vance had after he went to Yale Law School. He worked for this far-right billionaire oligarch in Silicon Valley who says very clearly that he does not support democracy. And he wrote in the Cato Institute, this libertarian think tank, that capitalism is more important than democracy, that people should not have a say, only corporations should have a say in political affairs. He co-founded Palantir. Palantir is basically running the U.S. government, especially spying not only on foreigners, but on U.S. citizens. The New York Times reported that Palantir is doing a massive mass surveillance operation to compile intelligence on all Americans under Trump. So this is the so-called free speech president, right? So anyway, the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, said that the U.S. is preparing for war on China, Russia, and Iran. The former the late U.S. imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, he's now passed away, but he was previously the national security advisor under Jimmy Carter, a hardened war criminal who oversaw the U.S. proxy war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, in which the U.S. supported the Mujahideen that became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, including Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of the Arab Mujahideen, fundraising for the CIA-backed death squads to fight against the Afghan socialist government in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Well, the war criminal who oversaw that operation was Brzezinski, and Brzezinski wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, in 1997, that the biggest threat to the U.S. unipolar empire was what he called an anti-hegemonic coalition between China, Russia, and Iran, which is essentially what we see today. I mean, it's not formal. China does not join formal alliances, but it's unofficial. There's a close partnership between China and Russia and also Iran. And what we're seeing is, I mean, so anyway, with all that said, they're in BRICS, right? China, Russia, and Iran are now in BRICS, along with many other countries. And getting back to this summit and Trump's threats, I mean, this is all related to exactly what we've been talking about with the U.S. and Israel waging war on Iran, the U.S. proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, using Ukraine as this, battering ram against Russia. It's all part of the same strategy to try to maintain U.S. global imperial dominance, unipolar dominance. And of course, we're in an increasingly multipolar world. This is one of the main things discussed at the BRICS summit, along with de-dollarization. And the U.S. empire has really 2 or 3 main weapons, very powerful weapons. One, it has a big military, but we've seen that the power of that military is probably overstated because, the U.S. is now spending $1 trillion. I mean, I was already spending over $1 trillion per year on the military unofficially. Now it's officially spending over $1 trillion officially. But just because you plow money into something doesn't mean that you actually are investing that money well. We've seen that the U.S. military lost pretty much every war that it's fought since World War II, even in a country like Iraq, which is a relatively small country. And now we see that the U.S. is losing the war in Ukraine. It's basically lost already. And they're talking about war on China. I mean, can you give me a break? Anytime the Pentagon does war games, they lose these war games against China. So I think that the power of the U.S. military is overstated. I mean, it can bully and destroy small countries, like it invaded Panama, it invaded Grenada, it destroyed Iraq, it destroyed Libya. But when it's actually facing near peer strategic competitors like Russia and China, it can't win. So I think that's exaggerated. Another weapon that you could say is arguable, the U.S. has a very powerful media propaganda apparatus that it can use to spread propaganda around the world. And it used to do so through, soft power organizations funding so-called media outlets and so-called NGOs through the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. But I mean, even those so-called NGOs in a lot of countries, like in Russia and certainly in China and other countries, they've cracked down on these U.S. color revolution groups that are used to meddle in foreign affairs. So the U.S. still does have very powerful propaganda institutions, the media, which is not it's not to inform people, it's to manufacture consent for U.S. wars of aggression. But even that influence is declining over time. So the last real weapon, a very strong weapon that the U.S. empire has, is the dollar. And that is definitely the most powerful weapon the U.S. has. And the U.S. can impose sanctions on countries and try to kick them out of the international financial institutions that are dominated by the U.S. But we've seen that over time, even that weapon has become weaker and weaker. Now we see that 1/3 of all countries on earth are under U.S. sanctions. 60% of low-income countries are under U.S. sanctions. And the more that the U.S. abuses the sanction weapon, the more it backfires and incentivizes countries to seek alternatives. Russia has been at the forefront of de-dollarization. China has joined in the de-dollarization efforts. They both have their own alternatives to the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which is controlled by the US. And BRICS is the main international platform pushing for de-dollarization. This is why Trump is so afraid of it, because he recognizes that without that weapon, the US dollar, the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar, the US empire loses a lot of power. And it's already losing wars. Its propaganda apparatus is weakening. And if it loses the dollar, I mean, that could be a fatal blow to the US empire.
Yeah. So talk about then what in this specific moment is causing so much consternation from Donald Trump with regard to the BRICS summit, because I think a lot of people maybe understated and misinterpreted the significance of this summit. We saw Lula da Silva, of course, this was held in Brazil this year, the summit, and he was the chair, and he had some very choice words for Donald Trump. Said that BRICS and developing countries are not looking for an emperor right now. And so I'm curious on what you saw was the significance toward these moves toward de-dollarization, because everyone was saying, from Dilma Rousseff, head of the NDB, the New Development Bank, Lula himself, Lavrov, everybody was saying, well, this is going to take some time, but everybody was talking about it still. And that was maybe less expected than maybe it should have been. Your thoughts?
Yeah, there's so many things I can respond to there. I want to make a few different points that I think are important to keep in mind. First of all, you mentioned Lula and the fact that this was in Brazil. And I agree with what you said earlier about this being a historic summit. And it was misrepresented in the Western media, as always, and portrayed as a failure, largely because Putin did not attend, China's president Xi Jinping did not attend, and also the Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian did not attend. But I think this is grossly overstated, the significance of this. First of all, Putin spoke via video stream, and he sent probably the second most important person in the Russian government after him, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. China sent the second in command of the premier, Li Qiang, who is a very important person in the Chinese government. Again, the most important after President Xi. And then, Iran's president, Pezeshkian, did not attend because he's preparing for a potential new war that the U.S. and Israel are going to wage against him. We already talked about this. I mean, if he's concerned that if he left Iran, the U.S. and Israel would restart the war. And then, they don't have their commander-in-chief in the country as they're fighting a war. I mean, he was also concerned that he could be assassinated as he was traveling. So, yeah, obviously, like I said, the war in the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran is not over. It was paused, but it's not over. So, of course, he didn't attend. But, okay, so really, also, Putin didn't attend the summit, the BRICS summit in 2023, which is also historic. It was the first summit where they expanded and added new members, including Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, the UAE. And at that time, Putin didn't attend because of the arrest warrant issued by the ICC over the war in Ukraine, which is so deeply hypocritical and absurd, because we've seen that Netanyahu, the leader of the Israeli regime, who's carrying out a genocide with the support of the US, there's an outstanding ICC arrest warrant for Netanyahu, and he's traveling constantly to Washington, going over European airspace. The Hungarian regime is supporting him. Viktor Orban loves to portray himself as like anti-woke and like fighting against globalism. But meanwhile, Hungary is also staunchly supporting Israel's genocide and doing everything it can to support Netanyahu, like the US regime. And that's why Hungary is actually withdrawing from the ICC in solidarity with Israel's genocide, because it's doing everything it can to support the Israeli genocide. I mean, Hungary has always been Orban he sometimes claims to be, I'm fighting against globalism because he's pro-Russia, but he's always been deeply anti-Muslim and Islamophobic, and has been allied against the revolutionary forces in West Asia, against the axis of resistance, helping the US and Israel fight against the axis of resistance. So, I mean, there's so much hypocrisy. Anyway, getting back to the ICC, Netanyahu is the European regimes that are also supporting the genocide in Gaza are helping Israel carry out this genocide and allowing Netanyahu cross over their airspace And yet they're the ones saying, we must arrest Putin. We have to arrest Putin because of the ICC arrest warrant. So this shows why these international institutions have been destroyed by all these Western regimes that talk about the rules-based international order, but they don't follow the rules when it's convenient for them. They tear up the rules when they don't like it, when they don't like those rules. So they say, oh, the ICC should only be for global South countries and Russia. By the way, this was stated by the former de facto foreign minister of the EU, and who is Joseph Borrell. And there are reports that this was also stated by other figures, other top officials in in these European regimes. Karim Khan, who is the ICC prosecutor, did an interview in CNN in which he said that he was told by European regime officials that the ICC is only for the third world, as they put it, for African countries. I mean, this is the racist colonialist mentality of these Western regimes. They talk about the rules-based international order. They don't believe in rules. They think Putin should be arrested, but Netanyahu should be given the Nobel Peace Prize for carrying out genocide. I mean, it's outlandish. Anyway, getting back to BRICS. I know I'm on these asides here, but it's related. So yeah, Putin did not attend the 2023 summit or the 2025 summit, although he did speak via video link, because it was out of respect for other BRICS countries hosting South Africa in 2023, Brazil in 2025, because these countries are parties to the ICC, and he didn't want to put these countries in a delicate diplomatic situation. However, it's not that significant. Further, the fact that he did not attend is not that significant. Furthermore, I actually think the fact that President Xi did not attend is also significant, but not in the way that Western propaganda thinks, saying that this is like supposedly China is like there's a fight in BRICS. It's not what's happening. Actually, I think this was a diplomatic move by China to show that BRICS is not just about China. It's not just about Russia. You know, we talk about the fact that China, Russia, and Iran are in BRICS, but there are now 20 countries in BRICS, 10 members and 10 partners. And the fact that Brazil hosted this, the fact that Brazil hosted the fact that Brazil invited other Latin American countries, including Mexico, was invited as an observer, even though it's not part of BRICS. That was very important and symbolic. China was showing, by not sending President Xi, that this is not about China, that this is actually about the global South, and many other countries are part of BRICS, and they're coming together. And yes, China is an important part of BRICS, but it's not a China-led organization, which is what Western propaganda often portrays it as. This is a global South-led organization. It's the voice of the global majority, the global South plus Russia, that's been kicked out of the global North, out of the West. Oh, well, it was never in the West, but kicked out of Europe at least. And what we now see is that BRICS is growing in influence, and there's more and more of a coherent vision. And Lula spelled out this vision at the BRICS summit. He said that BRICS is an heir to the non-aligned movement, and he also invoked the Bandung Conference of 1955. This was also mentioned by the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, and Malaysia has now joined BRICS as a partner country. And both Lula and Anwar said that BRICS follows in the footsteps of the non-aligned movement and the Bandung Conference. What does this mean? The Bandung Conference of 1955 was called by the formerly colonized countries of Africa and Asia. They came together in Bandung, Indonesia, under the leftist anti-colonial leader of Indonesia, Sukarno, to talk about ways to work together to fight against colonialism and to empower the global South, to support decolonization efforts. Similarly, the non-aligned movement was founded in the 1960s by formerly colonized countries, almost all with socialist governments, the initial founders of the non-aligned movement, saying that they refused to go along with U.S. imperialism in the first Cold War against the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. So BRICS is now bringing back this anti-colonial mantle. They've picked up the anti-colonial mantle, and they're fighting against U.S. dollar hegemony, which is a form of imperialism. They're fighting against Western imperialism, And it's not just China and Russia and Iran. It's a larger group that continues to grow. And despite the political differences that they have shown that they have a lot of similarities and common goals. And we can talk about some of those. Of course, de-dollarization is at the heart of that, but there are other initiatives going on. But I think this was a symbolic summit because it wasn't just about China. The fact that she wasn't there made it about the other countries as well, and showed that there's a lot of interest. And this is not just countries that are like puppets of China, as we hear in the Western media, right? Like the propaganda narrative in the West, which is absurd, is that BRICS is the Chinese empire's attempt to create its own organization to rule the world. It's complete nonsense. BRICS is not NATO. NATO was created by the US to be a US imperialist organization so the US could control Europe, keep Germany down, prevent Russia from joining, and keep the US on top. That's not, the G7 is similar. I mean, it's the cartel of the colonizers, the countries that colonize most of the world. That's not what BRICS is. BRICS is an it's an anti-hegemonic organization consisting of the global majority that's fighting for a more multipolar world, a truly democratic world that's not dominated by the Western colonial powers. That's not a democracy. You can't talk about democracy when the colonial powers dominate all of the international so-called multilateral organizations that the U.S. has veto power in. The U.S. has veto power in the UN Security Council, which it abuses constantly. The U.S. has veto power in the IMF. The U.S. has veto power in the World Bank. The U.S. has veto power in the WTO and has sabotaged the WTO with its veto power. BRICS is trying to create a new global order that is actually democratic, unlike the U.S. global dictatorship, which we saw under the unipolar era in the 1990s.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to get to, but perhaps before we talk about collective security, which was actually a big theme here, how about you talk about some of these initiatives that BRICS were discussed at the summit? Because yes, Donald Trump makes a huge emphasis on de-dollarization. But if anybody knows anything about China, you've lived there for quite some time now, Ben. I've traveled there many times. We've both spoken to so many people there. And if we don't understand that China and Russia too would very much do something like they did, which is not go to a summit like this so that other emerging, developing countries, those in the global south, can be more of an emphasis, then, you don't know China then, because China would do such a thing in a heartbeat. It does not lose anything from not going to a summit like this. In fact, China always says, and I think this is what distinguishes the multipolar world now from perhaps any other point in history, is that you have such a deep emphasis on sovereignty that it actually influences how these countries are cooperating. And it's very much about elevating everybody, but with a very much only so much so that these countries are working together on a very mutual basis, actually on as much of an equal basis as can be. And I think that is really at the heart of why BRICS is so much of a threat to Donald Trump and, of course, the rest of the U.S. elite. But Ben, how about you talk about some of these initiatives and anything you want to react to with this?
Yeah, BRICS is a so-called threat to the U.S. in scare quotes because the U.S. empire only seeks dominance and hegemony, and the U.S. refuses to join any organization it doesn't have veto power in. BRICS doesn't have veto. BRICS works on consensus, and it's about supporting peace and diplomacy, which is anathema to the U.S. empire, which is constantly at war. So in terms of de-dollarization, I'll mention a few different initiatives and institutions that BRICS is overseeing. Now, one of the biggest is the New Development Bank. This was created as an alternative to the World Bank, which the U.S. has veto power in. And the New Development Bank, the NDB, is currently led by Dilma Rousseff, who's the leftist former president of Brazil. She's from the same Workers' Party as the current president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. And both Dilma and Lula have been victims of U.S.-sponsored lawfare, judicial warfare. The U.S. backed judicial coups against both of them. against Dilma, who was impeached on completely bogus charges by U.S.-backed groups. And the U.S. Justice Department was deeply involved in all this nonsense, like Operation Car Wash. And then Lula was imprisoned, which is what led Bolsonaro to winning the election, because Bolsonaro was imprisoned, Lula was imprisoned on fake charges. And when Lula was the candidate running against Bolsonaro, he was going to win. He was leading in all the polls. He was imprisoned on fake charges of corruption. That then the U.S. backed this lawfare operation, which is what helped put Bolsonaro in power. And of course, Bolsonaro was an obedient U.S. puppet. And it's deeply anti-China, by the way, Bolsonaro, like Javier Milei in Argentina, another U.S. puppet. Lula was imprisoned on fake charges, and then he was later released, and the Brazilian Supreme Court expunged his record. All of the charges against him were erased because they were fake. And the UN, a UN special committee of international legal experts investigated his case and concluded that it was fake charges. It was politically motivated. It was the textbook example of lawfare, judicial warfare. And now, in an insane example of irony, Trump is hypocritically claiming that Bolsonaro is supposedly a victim of lawfare. It's the opposite of the truth. Bolsonaro tried to carry out a military coup after Lula won the election. He refused to recognize the election results, and he tried to carry out a coup. And fortunately, not all of the military went along with it. Some of the military did go along with it, but not all of it. And that's why the coup failed. And that's why he's facing legal consequences. You cannot carry out a failed coup and not expect legal consequences. The last time I checked, in every single country on earth, if you attempt a coup and you fail, you are going to prison, if not worse. So Bolsonaro should be lucky that he's even facing the very fair trial that he is, because he would be executed in a lot of countries. So Trump is saying, I mean, this is why Trump is threatening 50% tariffs on Brazil in a blatant act of imperialism, of meddling in Brazil's internal sovereign affairs. And this is why Lula said to Trump, screw you. We are a sovereign country. You want to threaten tariffs on us? Fine. We will trade with other countries. We'll trade with China and BRICS countries. We don't need you. So this is another example of this multipolar world we're in. If we didn't have China as Brazil's largest trading partner, if you didn't have BRICS, I think Brazil would not be in a strong enough position to be able to say to the U.S., screw you. We're not going to do what you tell us. So in terms of getting back to de-dollarization and the initiatives, so Dilma is currently the president of the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, and one of her main initiatives has been de-dollarization. She's been promoting lending in local currencies of BRICS members, and the New Development Bank has been expanding and now has 11 members, including the 5 original members and the expanded members. And at this BRICS summit that was held in Brazil, they added 2 new members, which were Uzbekistan and Colombia. Now, Colombia's accession to the BRICS Bank is very historic because Colombia has historically been one of the most compliant U.S. client regimes in the world. And that's why the revolutionary former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, famously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America, that obediently did whatever the U.S. wanted. It was, an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S. empire in South America, like Israel is for the U.S. empire in West Asia. Well, now Colombia has its first ever democratically elected left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, and he has pursued a non-aligned foreign policy, and he has supported BRICS, and he joined the New Development Bank. So the NDB has been de-dollarizing, giving out loans in local currencies instead of U.S. dollars under Dilma. Okay. Another organization that BRICS is overseeing is the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA, which was created by BRICS as an alternative to the IMF to provide short-term liquidity to countries that are having balance of payments issues. If they need to pay for their imports, they're running out of foreign currency. The CRA was created as an alternative to the IMF. The U.S. has veto power in the IMF. The CRA is still very much in the early stages, but BRICS is talking about strengthening that. BRICS is creating what's called a new investment platform, the NIP, which will provide alternative investment opportunities for BRICS countries, especially countries with big current account surpluses, these big trade surpluses, like in China, for instance. They want to park that excess foreign currency they have that they get from their exports. So one of the ways they can do that is by buying foreign assets. And historically, they bought a lot of U.S. Treasury securities, so they want to find alternatives. So this is an alternative. The new investment platform in BRICS is finding ways for China and other countries to invest in non-US dollar assets. Another institution overseen by BRICS is the BRICS Interbank Cooperation Mechanism, which is overseeing ways to create links between the central banks and the commercial banks in the BRICS countries, which works with another BRICS initiative, which is the BRICS Cross-Border Payments Initiative and the BRICS Payment Task Force, which is finding ways to link the banks in these different countries in BRICS so they don't need to go through the US-controlled SWIFT interbank messaging system. And so these banks in different countries don't have to use US correspondent banks, which is usually what happens. So there are so many different initiatives that BRICS is overseeing to pursue de-dollarization. Now, to be fair, Dilma herself said at the summit that de-dollarization is not going to happen in the short term immediately. It's a medium to a long-term process, but slow and steady wins the race. It's already happening. BRICS and China have signed an agreement to de-dollarize their trade, to trade with each other in their local currencies. Russia and China, Russia and Iran, China and Iran, Russia and India. They all have agreements. Also, the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia have agreements to trade in their local currencies. So there's a lot of progress. It's already happening. It's not just hypothetical. It's already in the works of de-dollarizing trade within BRICS. So even if they don't have a new global currency, which Lula is talking about, he wants to create a new global reserve currency to challenge the dollar. But that's going to be a more medium to a long-term process. In the short term, BRICS is de-dollarizing the trade and investment and capital flows among different BRICS countries and using their local currencies instead of the US dollar. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, the emphasis on local currencies, on national currencies being used in trade, I think the number was something like 90% now of trade between BRICS countries is happening in their own respective currencies. That is very significant, and I think it's emblematic of a larger problem that the U.S. sees with BRICS, is that de-dollarization, this move toward independent economic and financial development amongst themselves, is not only such a huge response to the weaponization of the dollar and the U.S. empire as a whole, but it fulfills, as Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia, as Brazil's Lula da Silva both said, it fulfills a long-term process that has gone through a lot of bumps and issues, but is still going on, which is full independence for the global south from their former colonial and imperial masters, or their current imperial and colonial masters. That seems to me the big problem that BRICS poses. Your final thoughts on that before I have another question for you.
Yeah, I was very glad to see that both Lula and Anwar of Malaysia mentioned colonialism and decolonization. And Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, gave a very interesting speech. And I was actually pleasantly surprised by how pretty revolutionary it was. Again, he invoked the legacy of the non-aligned movement and the Bandung Conference. He mentioned several anti-colonial leaders in the Global South who were all, revolutionary leftists, including Zhou Enlai, who is probably the second most powerful person in China after Mao, in the Mao era. He mentioned Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the founding father of India, the anti-colonial leader, who was himself, a left-wing leader. And he mentioned Sukarno, who was a socialist anti-colonial leader in Indonesia. So hearing the Prime Minister of Malaysia mention these leaders as a positive example, I think is very positive. Also, by the way, I forgot to mention, he mentioned the name of Kwame Nkrumah, who was the revolutionary socialist leader of Ghana, an anti-colonial leader. And it's especially important that he mentioned Nkrumah, because Nkrumah was the author of neocolonialism. So Nkrumah famously argued, by the way, Nkrumah was the victim of a US-backed coup, like, Allende in Chile and so many other leftist leaders in the global south, like Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019. So anyway, Nkrumah wrote this book, Neocolonialism, in which he argued that after the end of formal political colonialism by the European powers, there was a system of neocolonialism in which the Western colonial powers still controlled the global financial institutions and trade with their former colonies, and they basically controlled the economies of many of these countries in the global south, because even though they kicked out their colonial masters, their economies were underdeveloped, they were not industrialized, and they were reliant entirely on trade with their former colonial masters. And in the case of West Africa, which is where Nkrumah was from, it was especially important because France controlled the currency of West African countries in the CFA franc system, which was previously, the name of it was the Colonia France-Afrique, literally colonial. That was in the name, and they renamed it. They changed it, but it's a colonial currency. And still today in Western Africa, there are several countries that use this French currency controlled by France, even though France itself doesn't even use the franc anymore. France uses the euro. So when we talk about neocolonialism, it's not just a hypothetical, it's not just theoretical. Neocolonialism is deeply embedded in the structure of global capitalism, of international financial institutions that the US dominates, like the IMF, like the World Bank, which we've been talking about. So BRICS is about transforming these international financial institutions and creating true multilateral financial institutions so they can decolonize the global economy, so you can actually have true decolonization. So I think hearing Lula and Anwar talk about that, I think that was very important, because it makes it clear that this is one of the key missions of BRICS, following in the footsteps of the non-aligned movement.
Yes, and another significant piece of this, Ben, was of the BRICS 2025 summit was a big emphasis on collective security, as it might be called formally, or defense, as we could call it less formally. BRICS in their 2025 summit declaration made a number of statements that were significant. There was a statement condemning Ukrainian attacks on Bryansk, Kursk, and other regions of Russia. There was also a condemnation of the attacks on Iran conducted by Israel, but of course with U.S. backing. And of course, there was the declaration of a full and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. Talk about this part of it, Ben, the idea of collective security, because the major countries leading BRICS, Russia, China, now Iran as a newer member, but Iran is indeed very significant. Despite all of the disagreements that these countries in BRICS might have, I mean, we have China and India at the table with major disagreements, and you have all these BRICS countries with very different political systems, political orientations to various conflicts and wars around the world. They were able to agree on, I think, pretty significant points that are maybe being understated, but might speak to some of the fear that the U.S. has of BRICS too, uniting more and more the global South against these endless wars.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. When we talk about security, we should keep in mind that BRICS, I see BRICS fundamentally as an organization focused more on the economy, on finance and politics, not so much security. Security is more the purview of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which many BRICS countries are part of. However, as you pointed out, BRICS did mention security because they had a very long, comprehensive statement, the Rio de Janeiro Declaration. It was 31 pages, and it had over 100 different points that they addressed. So given all of that, they talked about climate change, which is a big thing, and the responsibility of the global north, the colonizing countries that caused the majority of climate change and carbon emissions. and yet the global south is suffering the worst consequences and needs funding, but the global north refuses to provide funding. That was a big discussion. Poverty reduction was important, also development, also, of course, de-dollarization and all of that. Culture was discussed, tourism and all of that, but of course, security was part of it. And as you mentioned, they condemned the US-Israeli war on Iran and Gaza and called for peace in Ukraine and all of this. But in terms of the way that BRICS sees security, I think it's the way that many global south countries see security, which is the opposite of the way the US sees security. The US sees security as the US empire must control everything. If the US doesn't control everything, it's not secure. If the US can't overthrow any government it doesn't like, it's not secure. If the US can't wage war wherever it wants and send troops wherever it wants and do military exercises off the coast of China, then it's not secure. Whereas BRICS has a collective view of security, which is that you cannot talk about security when other countries are also threatened by what you consider to be your security. And this gets back to the whole conflict in Ukraine. Russia has made it always clear that any security guarantees provided have to be mutual. That yes, that if the US, if the West, the US-led NATO forces want some kind of security arrangement with Russia, Russia also has to have its own legitimate security demands met. And the US and NATO and the EU refuse to meet them because they don't believe in mutual collective security. They believe in their own security at the expense of other countries. So now BRICS is in this very complicated situation where you have countries like China and India that have had border disputes. They're both members, they're founding members. You also have Iran and the UAE, which are members. Saudi Arabia was invited but has not officially accepted the invitation. But you have these countries that have potential security issues with each other that are all members. So how can they come together and resolve these differences through diplomacy? And they've shown that it's possible. By the way, ASEAN has shown that it's possible. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, there are now multiple countries from ASEAN that are part of BRICS, including Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand. And also, they have had their own disputes with China in the South China Sea, but they have resolved those disputes and they've come to security agreements through diplomacy, through talks, whereas the US is constantly meddling in Southeast Asia, trying to encourage conflict. So I think BRICS has actually shown that this is a model for what collective security can actually look like. And I already mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think that's an even better model because in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you also not only have China, Russia, and Iran and India, you also have Pakistan. And obviously, India and Pakistan have major security issues with each other, but they're all part of an organization. They meet every year and they discuss ways to peacefully resolve some of these issues through diplomacy. So I think, again, although I would not define BRICS as fundamentally an organization focused on security, it is something that they talk about. And I think that is a model for what this multipolar world could look like if, the US and Western imperial powers actually accept the end of their empires, accept the peaceful integration of the West into the rest of the world, and accept that they're just countries. They're not special countries. They're just countries like everyone else.
And Ben, I get to your point, and it appears perhaps there was a power issue that you had mentioned might happen, but no worries if you can hear me. I just want to say to your point, what's so interesting is that oftentimes you see, even among people who follow our work, there's a lot of underestimation. There's a lot of, oh, well, these countries aren't as strong as they say they are. Russia, China, Iran, BRICS is not as strong as it says it is, or maybe it's portrayed by independent observers because it can't mollywop, it can't destroy the United States' hegemony in a snap. But I think what I've always argued, Ben, and what I see BRICS doing, and of course the rest of the multipolar world doing, is that by building these blocks of development, the path toward independent development, one that can exist right now and grow in significant ways, whether it's de-dollarization, investments independent of the US dollar, mutual trade networks, all of these new independent institutions not reliant upon US and Western interference. All of this builds the blocks for a real, not only a real kind of security, but also a real legitimate chance at what China talks about, common prosperity. There's actually a chance if these blocks are built and these paths are built, and the response against them by the United States will only heighten that conflict, will only heighten those contradictions, which then, of course, lead to new kinds and new phases of fight and development itself. So really, I think we are seeing, despite some understandable sometimes impatience, but really what I think is a very kind of Western impatience with the process, I think we're seeing a real significant move forward. And you mentioned the underestimation and the propaganda by the Western media about this summit. Some of that too was, I think, even independent observers were underestimating maybe even Brazil's leadership, Lula's leadership, the idea that Brazil is not led by a Western stooge government right now, that Lula da Silva is actually quite independent and very much one of the few leaders actually calling for the creation of independent currencies itself. But your thoughts on this before we talk about, I want to talk about these drills against China.
Yeah, keep in mind, Lula was a co-founder of BRICS. It was partially his idea. I mean, not just him, but back when it was BRIC, B-R-I-C, before South Africa joined in 2010. It was founded in 2009. So Lula has always been a key supporter of the multipolar project in the Global South and understands that Latin America must unite and be independent of U.S. imperialism. Now, he has to be very careful. Anyone in Latin America has to be very careful, because if not, they'll end up like Cuba, under a brutal, suffocating U.S. blockade, facing coup attempts and sanctions and all of that. They have to be very, or Venezuela. I mean, the brutal blockade against Venezuela, trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy. So obviously, you have to be very careful in Latin America, and Lula is. He's not Fidel Castro, but he's always been a strong supporter of Brazil, working with other countries in Latin America and Africa and Asia to build a more multipolar world. And the fact that Brazil over time has deepened its economic integration with China and is less and less dependent on trade with the US has made it a little more possible for him to stand up even more to the US, even than before. This is his third term as president. Unlike compared to, say, Mexico, right? 80% of Mexico's exports go to the US. 80%. I mean, that's a level of dependency that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world other than Canada, right? And look how the US treats Canada. Trump is talking about annexing, colonizing Canada. So Mexico has to be very, very careful. But even that said, the current Mexican government is completely sovereign, non-aligned in its foreign policy. It has a left-wing, anti-colonial government under President Claudia Sheinbaum. She's been very impressive. And the previous president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they were both very impressive in how they were balancing carefully their relations with the US and the Global South. And the fact that Lula invited Mexico to participate in the BRICS summit as an observer, and President Sheinbaum accepted the invitation and sent Mexico's foreign minister, De La Fuente, that is a very important symbolic move that shows to the US that even a country like Mexico, that is more dependent than any other country on earth on trade with the US, even Mexico is telling the US, you have to stop bullying everyone and treating us like colonies. We are not colonies. We are independent, sovereign countries. Now, another quick point here. You were talking about security, and this is related. Another point that I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention is that I talked about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is not a military alliance at all. Obviously, it's not, because you have India and Pakistan are both members. And BRICS is even less so. It's never going to be a military alliance, ever, in a million years. It's not what it is. And I think it's important to look at, when we're talking about the decline of U.S. imperialism in a multipolar world and what the multipolar world could look like, there are different possibilities. There's a multipolar world like World War I, where you have a lot more war and conflict. But there's also the kind of multipolar world that is envisioned by BRICS, by Brazil, and by China, which could be potentially a more peaceful multipolar world without imperialism. And I think China actually has shown what that could look like, because China is not a member of a military alliance. And even though we've talked about this, you and I, Denny, even though China and Russia have the best relations they've ever had in their history, and they say it's solid as a rock, and they always reaffirm that, they do not have a military alliance. China does not have a military alliance with anyone, and China does not refer to its partnership with Russia as an alliance. It's a comprehensive strategic partnership. And I actually really I think China and also Vietnam and ASEAN countries can be a good model for what the multipolar world could look like, including also in terms of security, right? Because I mentioned that in ASEAN, they have border disputes in the South China Sea, right, with their different islands and stuff. Vietnam, I think, has a very sensible policy of the 4 no's, where Vietnam says it will not join a military alliance, it will not engage in a war against another country, it will not allow foreign countries to build military bases in Vietnamese territory, and it will not join in a form of military alliance. It has a non-aligned foreign policy. Like, I think that is a very sensible policy that many countries could be able to pursue. And China basically has the same thing. It doesn't call it the 4 no's, but that's what Vietnam calls it. It's basically the same policy. And I think BRICS, if you looked at their philosophy, I think it's basically a very similar philosophy based on non-interference and non-alignment. And well, I don't think the U.S. will pursue that unless there's a revolution in the U.S., which it's desperately needed in the U.S. as a revolution. But when we're talking about BRICS, I just wanted to highlight that point that I had forgotten to mention, and what you said there reminded me of that there is a model for what the future of international relations and conflict resolution could look like. And I see the seeds of that in China and Vietnam, and they're very sensible models. And Brazil, one more quick point. And Brazil, Latin America, by the way, has declared itself a region of peace, a zone of peace. And the only violent conflicts in Latin America that we've seen in the past century have been U.S. conflicts, U.S.-fueled wars. I mean, the U.S. invaded Panama, the U.S. invaded Grenada, the U.S. supported the contra-terrorist death squads in Nicaragua, the U.S. supported the violent drug war in Mexico, the U.S. supported the violent drug war in Colombia, and there was a very low-level civil war in Colombia that was sponsored by the U.S. through Plan Colombia that would have ended without U.S. support. It was basically a war against the left in Colombia. But in terms of these are internal conflicts. Obviously, the drug war in Mexico has been horrible and very violent, and the U.S. bears a big role in that as well. But I'm saying that there haven't been interstate conflicts in this region. It's a zone of peace, and Latin America has always emphasized that it's a zone of peace and resolved their disputes diplomatically, like Southeast Asia. So it's possible for this to happen. It's not like some utopian vision. The problem is imperialism. You cannot have peace that coexists with imperialism. And BRICS is making that very clear as well.
Yeah, and as you were talking, my final point on this would be a lot of people, I don't know if you saw the reports and some of it being just pure like clickbait garbage, but a lot of talk about during the Iran-Israel 12-day war, whatever we want to call it, really the U.S.-Israeli aggression against Iran. There was a lot of fear, and I think some of that stoked by we could call our enemies, and even some of our friends were talking about how, okay, China, Russia, they don't do enough to help Iran. Iran doesn't do enough to help themselves by aligning more with Russia and China militarily. And what's so interesting about this, as I've been thinking about it, Ben, is that this seems to understate, one, how important it is for countries like Iran and really the entire global South to be able to both defend themselves and develop themselves independently. And that this Cold War mentality that is over a century old is one that is very much rejected by especially the leaders of the multipolar world, but really the entire global south at this point. That's probably one thing that almost everyone could agree on within BRICS, for example. And then it does understate too how much it matters for countries like China, for example, to stay out and not interfere in the affairs directly in other countries, but yet do very helpful and useful things, which probably saved Iran and has saved Iran in these many years of war, economic war with the sanctions. And now we just saw one of the most aggressive attempts to militarily defeat Iran. If it weren't for example, its huge economic relationship with China, if it wasn't for all of the assistance diplomatically, militarily, economically as well with Russia, and of course now being a BRICS member and having countries within BRICS defiantly break sanctions to work with Iran. If it wasn't for all of that, Iran would probably not be standing. So I think that's one point I want to emphasize that I think some miss. I don't know if you have any comments on this.
Yeah, the reason that China has not been involved in a war since 1979 is precisely because it takes this issue very seriously. China does not join in military alliances because that could drag China also into war, right? And it makes the possibility of war sometimes more likely. Look at NATO. There's this idea that supposedly NATO was to prevent war. NATO is it's a force of war and imperialism. They destroyed Yugoslavia. They destroyed Libya. They're destroying Ukraine. They're preparing for more war with Russia. I mean, it's crazy. You listen to all these people in Europe saying as if Russia's going to like march into Paris. It's absurd. So China, by being non-aligned, by not having military alliances, it's one of the ways it's been able to not be involved in a war since 1979. The U.S. is at war every year. So again, we have to think about these issues in a very different way. And this is what BRICS is trying to do. But obviously, it's very difficult to do when you're dealing with this just monstrous war machine in the U.S. that's just constantly, everywhere it goes, destroying countries, leaving behind rubble in Libya and Syria and Yemen, and trying in Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, and then now threatening China and Russia and Ukraine and Yugoslavia. I mean, everywhere it goes, it just destabilizes countries. That's part of the, by the way, that's the goal. I mean, that's how they profit. That's how U.S. corporations profit from all of this. It's not the side effect, it's the intended impact. So we have to have a complete change of the global order. And this is what BRICS is trying to do. But at the same time, I mean, if you think about how many significant watershed shifts happened in world history, it was in major wars. So World War I led to the rise of fascism. World War II led to the collapse of European empires, and decolonization would not have been possible without World War II because the European empires destroyed themselves, right? And the Japanese empire. So, and you have these massive, the U.S. Civil War was what really made the abolition of slavery possible. So when you have these significant changes, the Russian Revolution was really only solidified after the Russian Civil War, the internal war, which wasn't really a civil war because there were a dozen imperialist countries that invaded the Soviet Union right after the Russian Revolution, including the US. The Chinese Revolution was only possible after World War II and an internal civil war. So you have these massive political shifts in the world. The creation of Bretton Woods and the United Nations was because of World War II. Now, what I'm getting at here is, yes, if we want to completely change this colonial order, it would be possible to just have World War III, and then the West has to lose, and then we create a new order out of that. But we also have nuclear weapons. It's also not guaranteed the U.S. loses. You could have both sides lose. I mean, I don't think the U.S. would win, but I mean, it's very dangerous to say, let's just have war, right? Like, I think there are a lot of people on the internet who, like, you know, there's just these keyboard warriors who say, like, yeah, Iran should sacrifice itself and wage all-out war on Israel, the Israeli regime, which obviously is completely illegitimate, a colonial apartheid regime. But Iran also has to act with patience and restraint because Israel has nuclear weapons. It has the backing of the world's largest military power, the U.S. empire. I mean, and asking like China to just say, okay, you have to engage in World War III to defeat the U.S. empire, which everyone in the world wants the U.S. 80% of the world wants the U.S. empire to be defeated. It's objectively just destroying the planet, but World War III could also destroy the planet. So what I'm getting at here is that be careful what you wish for. Like what BRICS is trying to do is trying to create a new global order, but avoiding World War III. And they have to be very careful to prevent World War III, which is looking increasingly likely. And I personally think we should do everything we can to avoid World War III, given the existence of nuclear weapons and how insane people in Washington are, not just the Republicans, but the Democrats. I mean, a lot of people in Washington would rather commit nuclear war than accept the decline of the U.S. empire.
Yeah.
And BRICS is trying to prevent that.
Yeah. And sometimes maybe people are forgetting that the nuclear option is I think some people may say, well, the nuclear option would destroy everything, so the system wouldn't want to destroy itself. Let's not count chickens before they hatch. That is not an impossibility. If there is any kind of World War open military conflict between any of these countries, including Iran, even if it's simply Iran, even if something like what happened in the so-called 12-day war, if that were to expand, if the war of attrition were to happen and Israel was looking very much on the ropes, which is likely possible in a war of attrition, what does the United States do? The United States can't conventionally assist Israel to the point where it can last for as long as it can and succeed in its objective of winning. So what does that mean? That means they're going to look at options that Iran doesn't have, and that maybe China and Russia are very hesitant to use. Nobody wants to use nuclear weapons or at least nobody else except for the United States wants to use, and maybe Israel, use nuclear weapons for any offensive purposes. They are a deterrent for a reason. China has no first use policy. Russia changed its nuclear doctrine, but for a long time did not have a first use policy. Of course, the DPRK, their policy is we have a nuclear weapon because we need it, and we can go on and on. But the point is I think people should understand, in the West especially, that if the problem is the U.S. empire, and it has thousands of nuclear weapons, and it is not going to let go of its empire without a fight, and this is why I constantly emphasize the decline. That's because that decline leads more and more to the more desperate options, to the more maybe absolutely insane options like nuclear weapons. So people should not underestimate this, because, Ben, in our final thing I wanted you to comment on today, because you mentioned China, and we talked about the United States being mired in a proxy war in Ukraine. It is very much now in a protracted quagmire, highlighted by Israel's genocide in Gaza, extending all the way to Iran and West Asia. But the United States is still very committed, and kind of under our noses, not being noticed, is the fact that the U.S., in the month of July into August, is waging what it's calling a massive Air Force drills with an eye on Pacific war with China. Now, the U.S. Pacific Command, or whatever, Indo-Pacific Command, whatever it's calling it, they're not specifically naming China, but the Western mainstream media is, such as Newsweek, with these exercises. And they're huge. They're involving 12,000 personnel from the Air Force and Space Force and 350 aircraft. This is a department-level exercise, which is unprecedented in its scope. And there's also drills in Taiwan happening under our nose again. And these are also expanded from past drills. So these are actually annual drills that are happening. But U.S. weapon systems are actually featured in these for the first time. There were major delays to these kinds of systems, the Hong Kong exercise. And I just want to highlight what these systems are. The HIMARS, which we've seen in Ukraine, as well as other anti-ship and anti-air missiles. These weapons were delayed because of a major backlog the U.S. Has with Taiwan. But nonetheless, Ben, there is preparations for war with China, and it's not being talked about. Your assessment, your analysis of what's going on here.
Yeah, if you listen very clearly to what Trump administration officials are saying, they're not hiding it. The US is preparing for war with China. And why? Because China is the only country powerful enough to challenge the US empire, the global dominance of the US empire politically, militarily, economically, technologically. This was stated very clearly by Marco Rubio, who is probably the second most powerful person in the US government after Trump. He's simultaneously serving as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, making him the second person in US history to do so after the notorious war criminal Henry Kissinger. Marco Rubio said in his Senate confirmation hearing that China is the biggest threat the US has ever faced in history. He said it's much of a bigger threat than the Soviet Union was, because he argued that the Soviet Union was never at the same level as the US economically, technologically, and militarily, whereas China is basically at the same level militarily. It's catching up very quickly technologically and economically. It's grown extremely quickly. And the tier one cities in China are definitely at the same level, if not higher than the major cities in the US. So China is seen as the main threat to the dominance of the US empire, the hegemony of the US empire, and they're preparing for war. And there's this ridiculous narrative in the Western media that supposedly China is going to carry out a war over Taiwan in 2027 based on a complete misrepresentation of what President Xi Jinping said about saying that Chinese military should be prepared. But he wasn't saying we're going to invade Taiwan in 2027. It's a complete misrepresentation. But you hear this a lot in the Western media, and because of that, you hear a lot of U.S. government officials saying that the U.S. military should be prepared for a war with China by 2027. Now, it's very clear that China does not want a war. We've already been talking for a long time now about how China has not fought a war since 1979. China supports peace and diplomacy. It does not engage in violent conflicts unless it's existential. For China, Taiwan is existential. One, Taiwan is part of China, according to international law. You go to the United Nations, there is no Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. You look at even US-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund, go to their website, it says Taiwan, province of China. According to international law, Taiwan is a province of China. The US is trying to break it off. The US is supporting these secessionist groups that do not have the support of the majority of the Taiwanese population. Polls show that only around 7% of people in Taiwan actually want to immediately declare independence, a small minority of the population. The vast majority of the population wants the status quo, which is also the case in the Chinese mainland. They want the status quo. They don't want a war. There are a lot of people in the mainland who have cousins and uncles and friends and business partners across the Taiwan Strait in Taiwan province. So they don't want a war, and vice versa. There are so many people in Taiwan who have family members and friends and business partners, colleagues in the mainland. So, I mean, they're brothers and sisters. It's absurd. It's the US that's pushing for this war. And by the way, just like how the US pushed Ukraine into this horrible conflict, using them as cannon fodder, into the meat grinder of war, similarly, the US is doing the same in Taiwan, and they're not hiding it. Trump has made it very clear that he wants to threaten Taiwan with tariffs to force the most important company in Taiwan, TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, to move out of Taiwan to the United States. This is also the case under Biden. Biden, through the CHIPS Act, was providing subsidies and incentives for TSMC to build factories in the US, in red states, actually, like Arizona. And Trump has continued to threaten Taiwan to try to force them to move their most important equipment out of Taiwan. This is for chips, the most advanced chips. TSMC makes the most advanced chips in the world, and even the US has not caught up to this, and the Chinese mainland has not caught up to this. So the US is basically telling Taiwan, we're going to push you into the meat grinder of war to try to isolate China, to try to turn the world against China, even though almost every single country on earth recognizes that Taiwan is part of China, even technically on paper, the US. The only countries that refuse to do so are like They're 12 countries and they're tiny. They have a collective population of less than 1% of the world population. They include the biggest countries, Guatemala and Haiti and Paraguay. And the US government threatens these countries and blackmails them and says, if you recognize the People's Republic of China, we'll organize a coup or a color revolution and all this. So, I mean, it's the US that's pushing for conflict. And if you listen to Pete Hegseth, I mentioned this already, but I'll repeat. Pete Hegseth, who's this extremist Christian fundamentalist who wrote a book in 2020 called American Crusade, in which he proudly identified himself as a crusader. He was a Fox News host. Trump watched him all the time on Fox News and liked him. So he said, you should be my defense secretary overseeing the Pentagon. Pete Hegseth said in this book, American Crusade, that the U.S. is in a holy war. The right wing in the U.S., which he identifies as part of, is in a holy war against the international left, what he calls communist China. He always, whenever he says China, including as defense secretary, he says communist China, where we're preparing for war with communist China.
The communist Chinese, that during that speech in Brussels, that was even in Brussels in February, when he was declaring this whole so-called shift with Ukraine, Europe is going to have to pay. There, he also said, well, the big threat for us is the communist Chinese in Mexico. But that's the but yes, you're exactly right. That's the narrative. Continue.
Yeah, I mean, in his book, again, this was not published 30 years ago. This was published 5 years ago in 2020. In American Crusade, he says the U.S. is in a holy war against China. And he said that the U.S. wants to overthrow the Communist Party of China. And he said China will be licking its wounds for 200 years. So he's saying that he wants not only another century of humiliation, he wants 2 more centuries of humiliation in China. I mean, this guy's a colonialist. He's the head of the Pentagon. And he's giving speeches in Singapore, in Japan, in the Philippines, in Brussels, saying, we are preparing for war. That is a quote, we are preparing for war, end quote. So they're not hiding it. But the Trump administration, unlike the Biden administration, which was also preparing for war, but the Biden administration, the Democrats, they use this rhetoric about the rules-based international order, human rights, all this nonsense, which is just propaganda. The Trump administration, the Republicans are very different. They go a step further, and instead of portraying themselves as multilateral, they're proud about being unilateral imperialists. They're proud of it. They say we should emphasize the fact that we're imperialists. We should boast of it. We should threaten other countries openly, and we should say we're preparing for war, because this is the kind of, like over-the-top bellicose, like alpha male nonsense that they do, like this hyper high T, macho strategy, which is very, by the way, it's very dangerous. And it's also very unprofessional for leaders of militaries and diplomats. If you can call anyone in the Trump administration a diplomat, they're not diplomats, but they go around the world saying this kind of stuff. I mean, it just shows how no one takes the U.S. seriously, but they're afraid of the U.S., even though, I mean, they recognize that the U.S. is declining, the U.S. empire is declining, and no one takes the U.S. seriously, but they're afraid that it's run by a bunch of insane maniacs who have tons of nuclear weapons and are the most likely country to use those nuclear weapons to destroy the planet. And of course, the U.S. is the only country on earth that has ever used nuclear weapons twice. So, I always emphasize this, and I think this is a good note to end on, that we shouldn't overestimate the power of the U.S. empire. It's obviously in severe decline. And Trump is a clear example of that. I mean, he's the best example of that. However, we shouldn't underestimate the possibility of severe damage done by the U.S. empire as it's in decline, because empires often commit their worst crimes when they're in decline. The Japanese empire in World War II, when it was colonizing many parts of Asia and committing many crimes comparable to the crimes committed by the Nazis. What the Japanese did in Southeast Asia and China, I mean, in Korea, very comparable to what the Nazis did. They had their own concentration camps. And the biological and human experimentation, all this horrific stuff they were doing. And then, of course, you have the Ottoman Empire carrying out the Armenian genocide, also against the Assyrians and the Greeks. And then you have the German Empire culminating in Nazi Germany and fascism, and the Italian Empire culminating in fascism. And then we see the US Empire now culminating once again in fascism. So it's very dangerous what's happening in the US. And especially, of course, they want to go out with a bang. Their view is if the US Empire is going to decline, they'd rather drag down the entire world with them. And they want this apocalyptic war with China because they recognize that China has developed economically and militarily so quickly in such a short period of time that if the US empire waits 10 more years, there's no way. I mean, there's no way the US could actually take down China. But the way to think about it now is if they do it now in the next few years, when China is not super far more advanced than the US, far beyond the US, they might lose. All the war games done by the Pentagon shows that the US either loses or both sides lose. Right. And the perspective of the maniacal imperialists in Washington is they would rather both sides lose than just the US losing.
Yeah, and China, of course, winning. And to your point, Ben, even in this article that I shared earlier from Newsweek, I just highlighted this part, the way that Taiwan is talked about. It's all about Taiwan being that meat grinder proxy for the United States, similar to Ukraine, but different in the sense that Taiwan has far more disadvantages. For example, if it was used as a separatist proxy against China, it does not have an 800,000 person army that's been training for almost a decade by NATO. That definitely has not been happening. But they talk about weapons,
also,
right?
It's a small island.
It's a very small island.
Ukraine is a massive country in the middle of Europe. I mean, defending an island, like that's very different.
Yeah, that's and the type of war, a very different kind of war. And here you have, they just talk about HIMARS launches. Okay, they got 11 of those back in November 2024. Oh, look, they have M1A2 Abrams tanks. They have these TOW-2B anti-tank missiles. But that's all that matters with Taiwan for the United States. It's all about Taiwan being militarized so that it can supposedly fight this conflict against China. And even, I don't know if you've noticed this too, Ben, even operations, for example, there was recent drills in the Philippines, F-35, flyovers, whatever. But even just like the transfer of anti-ship missiles, every time that happens, or there were also military drills happening there with the United States, every time there's an ally, so-called, like the Philippines, every time they're discussed as working with the United States, Taiwan always comes up because seems to be the flashpoint from which this overall agenda that they're trying to push, this war agenda they're trying to push, is being forwarded. But yet it's just so blatant. It's all about going to war, and it doesn't really matter, it seems like, what the results of that war will be. The war is more important itself.
Yeah, because it's not about the people of Taiwan and what they want, which again is the status quo. They don't want independence. It's about what the US empire needs, which is to try to damage China, to try to isolate China. And I've repeatedly emphasized here that what we call the media or the press in the West, it's not that. It's propaganda, and it's trying to manufacture consent. And everything it's doing is to manipulate public opinion to manufacture consent for a US war on China through Taiwan, just like the propaganda over Ukraine, going back to the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014 and the low-scale war from 2014 until 2022. It was all preparation for war, like the lead up to the illegal US invasion of Iraq with all the preparation. We see that now. I mean, you can see it's so obvious when you study past conflicts, past wars. But this is even crazier than even the invasion of Iraq and all of that. As crazy as and criminal as all of those wars were, Taiwan is part of China. Even technically, the US recognizes that. It's according to international law, Taiwan is part of China. But even on paper, the US recognizes that when it signed the 3 communiques, when it normalized relations with China in the 1970s and the early 1980s. And yet the US is violating the spirit of the very foundations of its diplomatic relations with China. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, we just have one question from the audience, Ben, that I think might be interesting to you. I haven't followed this, but I did see it happening when it was occurring. It says, what is your take on the so-called censorship of Brazil of X last year? Donald Trump did mention this in his diatribe letter against Brazil and the threats. Oh, you know, they're censoring social media. It's so horrible. Weren't they protecting the country from Elon Musk's info campaign? This is from Kevin Wayne. Thanks, Kevin, for supporting the show.
Yeah, it's complete nonsense. It's fake news. It's disinformation. The idea that Brazil's like censoring everyone. First of all, the US has been using social media platforms to interfere in Brazil's internal sovereign affairs. Brazil is an independent sovereign country. It has the right to restrict foreign meddling. And Elon Musk was blatantly meddling and spreading fake news and disinformation to destabilize the democratically elected leader of Brazil. There are so many examples of this. This is why China restricted US social media, because the US was using these platforms to destabilize the Chinese government as a form of meddling, as a form of imperialism. And Brazil will not tolerate that. Second of all, Brazil does not have the same kind of laws as the US. Brazil does respect freedom of the press and such. But for instance, one of the main issues happening in Brazil was that literal Nazi gangs that were engaged in violent crimes, literal Nazis. I'm not saying that they're just like right-wingers and like insulting them. Literal Nazis who admire Adolf Hitler and proudly identify as Nazis, who were engaged in criminal activity and violence and hate crimes. You know, Brazil is a very diverse country. Over half of Brazilians are of African descent. They take, you know, racism and hate crimes very seriously. These Nazi gangs were using Twitter in order to organize their activities. And the Brazilian authorities said, they told Twitter, you have to give us information about these Nazi gangs using your website to carry out hate crimes. And Elon Musk said, no, screw you. This is free speech. Well, newsflash, in most countries on earth, that would be a crime. In most countries on earth, they would require these companies to give them information about these groups engaged in illegal criminal activity. Like, it's not just Brazil. The US has this particular, I mean, even in the US, honestly, like Facebook does this all the time. Facebook constantly engages in law enforcement requests by the FBI, by ICE. They do it constantly in Israel, by the way, as well. And Elon Musk does it in Israel against Palestinians. This has nothing to do with free speech. Elon Musk was using Twitter, his personal property, as a way to violate the sovereignty of Brazil, to destabilize and undermine the democratically elected left-wing president of Brazil. And Elon Musk has been openly conspiring with Jair Bolsonaro and the right wing in Brazil to try to put them in power. He's not hiding it. Look at his Twitter account. He's constantly praising Bolsonaro, spreading fake news about Lula and the Workers' Party. I mean, this is imperialism, and Brazil was defending its sovereignty. This whole free speech thing is nonsense, especially considering how Elon Musk has no problem censoring Palestinians, has no problem censoring people at the request of the US government, but the Brazilian government he doesn't like.
Yeah, and he also, I remember back when Bolivia was having its own, what was that, 2019, the coup attempt in Bolivia. And he was very open on X at the time before he owned it, saying that, oh, well, we'll coup whoever we want. And we know that Elon Musk's Tesla and, is very much interested in the lithium that exists in Bolivia. So Elon Musk
said, this is an exact quote, we will coup whoever we want, deal with it, end quote. That's what he said. So take him at his word.
Yep. And then people get angry. I don't know how many times I've heard, Danny, why would China not allow Google, not allow Facebook, not allow Meta or whatever it's called now, not allow these social media institutions, these corporations of the West to exist freely inside of China? And first of all, Google wasn't following Chinese laws, so that was why it had to leave. But the Great Firewall, a big part of it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and so that's the point. And in China is already, their cybersecurity firms have already uncovered all kinds of ways in which the CIA has attempted to. They can't get into China.
Yeah, Palantir is the CIA. Palantir was founded with CIA seed money. Google is a contractor for the CIA and the Pentagon and the FBI. Like these are all these big tech corporations are instruments of U.S. power, and it's not really soft power. Calling it soft power is it's hard power. The U.S. uses these groups to blatantly interfere in foreign affairs of other countries. This is why not just China, but also Russia and many other countries have restricted these big tech companies.
Yeah, if they don't, you're putting the country's sovereignty in danger. It's actually a duty of an independent country, a government that claims that it is working in the interests of the people, whether it's China or anywhere else, to take these measures. It's not free speech now is actually much far down the line of importance, because it's not free speech, it's a weapon. So if you're at war, you're not going to allow those who are waging war against you to do so freely. That's what you call suicide.
Really quickly on this issue of free speech, it's just so ridiculous. In Brazil, anyone who's used Twitter can see that there are so many right-wing trolls from Brazil constantly spreading propaganda everywhere you look. The idea that like the Brazilian government is censoring everyone, it's nonsense. It's totally false. It's not about free speech. It's about the fact that fascist gangs that are engaged in violent crimes are using these social media platforms to carry out crimes. And the Brazilian judicial system asked Twitter to restrict them and to give them information about these fascist gangs. And Elon Musk said, no, that's not free speech.
No.
It would be free speech if someone went on Twitter and said, I hate Lula. He's bad. He's corrupt.
Yes.
And then Lula was like, we need to censor that person. That's not what's happening at all.
No. And we've seen what's happening in Brazil is happening all over. It may not be happening anymore in Malaysia, Argentina, which Musk loves so much, but whether it's Brazil or Cuba or Venezuela, we've seen over and over again how social media is used as a tool, literally, of the CIA and, of course, the U.S. and the West's intelligence apparatus to commit not only to infiltrate and to spy. They're actually waging war. They're building an opposition. They're building mercenaries. They're building up a counter revolution or a color revolution against those countries. That's war, whether we want to believe it or not, or see it as that or not, because it certainly isn't. It doesn't look like the front lines of Ukraine, but it has the same roots. Ben, any final thoughts before we head out of here?
No, we hit a lot of different topics. Thanks for having me, Danny. It was great.
Of course. Yeah. Well, everybody, Ben's YouTube channel, Geopolitical Economy Report, is in the video description. Also in the video description are all the places you can support this channel: Substack, Patreon, PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, whatever. And hit the like button before you go, because that helps keep the YouTube algorithm going after we are done here. Without further ado, everybody, have a good rest of your Friday, if it's still Friday where you are. And I'll see you again soon.